Okay, so this morning we'll be looking at Genesis chapters 40 and 41, and it's a lot of text. I'll tell you up front, we're not going to read all of the text because it is quite a lot of verses, but we're going to go through these two chapters, continuing to look at Joseph and how he was a man of integrity. We've been looking at integrity and kind of have been doing some character studies in the Old Testament so far, but we have did an overall overview of what is integrity. And if you remember, we had decided the dictionary definition is that integrity is the quality of being honest or having strong moral principles. These are just some things that integrity is. It's doing what's right, even when nobody is watching. Integrity is what you are, not just what you say you are. And we the last sermon we talked about Joseph. That integrity is doing what's right, even if it costs me. And today, I'd like to focus in a little bit on a person of integrity works while waiting. I've entitled the message "Working While Waiting." Waiting on God. When we ended our sermon a couple weeks ago in chapter 39, we left Joseph in prison, and I'd kind of like to read the last number of verses there, couple verses 21 through 23 in chapter 39. It says, "But the Lord was with Joseph." He was thrown into prison. It says, "But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." One of the first things we notice here, we've seen Joseph kind of has a roller coaster of a life here, but it stands out that God is blessing Joseph. Here he mentions it again. God, the Lord, was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. God continues to bless Joseph here in prison. But one of the things that goes with that, Joseph wasn't just sitting in his cell, sitting on his cot or the floor possibly. I don't know what the prisons were like back then. He wasn't just sitting in his cell feeling sorry for himself and sitting in a corner and saying, well, here I did what was right and here I am in prison. God doesn't care. We see him working. We see him taking charge of the prisoners. He, again, he builds up trust. He builds up that trust, and the people around him trust him and give him responsibility. Continue to give him the responsibility to the point that the warden handed stuff over, and it says he didn't even care about anything anymore. He just let Joseph lead. Joseph himself was a prisoner, but he was placed in charge over the others. He was placed in a role that he was in charge of things, and then it says that God made him to succeed. And I wonder what kind of success looks different than my interpretation of success, I guess. What success do you get in prison? But it says that God was making whatever he did, God was causing it to succeed. He was being faithful where God had placed him, not the place where he wanted to be, not how he was hoping to spend the next number of years of his life, but in that moment, in that time, he was faithful and he was working. How many of you know who Michael Jordan is? Okay, I think most people, there's some that didn't raise their hand. I don't know if you are honest, you don't know who it is, but Michael Jordan was arguably one of the best basketball players of all time. And we're not going to open that argument, we'll just leave it there. He was very instrumental in the Chicago Bulls, winning 6 NBA championships. They beat 6 years out of 8. which is just an incredible feat. They won 3 in a row, 91 through 93. They beat three years in a row, and because of that, the term was, the phrase was coined three-peat. The second year they beat, there was a repeat, and then I remember it was blasted all over, there's a three-peat. They won 3 years in a row mostly because of Michael Jordan. There were others on the team as well, but he was just a great player. And he had good talent. He had amazing talent, but people attribute most of his winning to his hard work, his work ethic, and his routine. His practice routine was far above anything else up to his time anyway. Nobody had ever done things. I read an article. I was looking for it this week again. I couldn't find the exact article or book. But he was said to have been the first of his team, of the staff, of I think their whole staff. He was the one that came in the morning, turned the lights on. He was there working out and practicing at their facility. First one there and the last one to leave. He was there. He was always working out and trying to improve. He was putting in the work to get better. He was working. He spent countless hours doing this, practicing and working out to improve him. And he is stated, this quote is from him. I don't know where or when he said this, but he said, "If you do the work, you get rewarded. There are no shortcuts in life." And it showed. He was willing to put in the time, the energy, the work it took to get things done. I, on the other hand, was not ever accused of that, I don't think. In fact, in junior high, Elmer, are you agreeing with me, or? I had in junior high, my junior high teacher, he said, "Marcus," he said, "you're the type of person who's always looking for the easy way out. You're always looking for that shortcut." And I was. And that stuck with me. I've always remembered that. Whenever I'm tempted to try to find the easy way out of something, I think of Mr. Miller and what he said. It hurt at the time, but it was true. I would spend more time trying to get out of doing my homework than if I would have just sat down and done it. I didn't enjoy schoolwork, especially homework. But the point is, we can try to get out of work, we can try to get around work, but we are called to, there's no shortcuts, there's no easy way around things. As Michael Jordan said, it takes work, it takes effort. We need to apply ourselves, and that work will be rewarded. There's no shortcuts in life. So we see Joseph as that type of person. We see Joseph as a worker. Wherever he was in, whatever position or place he found himself, he was working, he was doing what he could to better his position. I want to go ahead and read chapter 40. We'll read verses 1 through 8. Can get a start of what's going on here. Verse 1, it says, "Sometime after this, after he was put in charge of the prison, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody of the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in his custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody of his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Okay, so we look at this. it doesn't tell us what the cupbearer or the baker did to offend the king. They obviously did something pretty severe. He had him thrown into prison. He said, take him to prison. And they ended up here in Joseph's care. Joseph was appointed to kind of take care of them and attend to them. And we don't know the exact timeline of this, but it does say in the end of verse 4, they continued for some time in custody. There was some time there. We don't know if that's weeks, months. It possibly could be years, but probably more like months. And one night, they both dreamed a dream. The same night, they both had a dream, a separate dream, a different dream, but they were both woke up the next morning, and it says that they were troubled. And one thing I'd like to draw our attention to here, verse 6, that I think for myself, I've kind of skipped over this and not really caught this, but we notice that it says that Joseph saw that they were troubled. Joseph cared about others. He wasn't just focusing on his own problems. He had plenty of them. He had plenty of his own problems, but he noticed when others were struggling as well. He was looking out and caring for others. One sure way to take the focus off your own problems is to care about someone else's. And that's what we see Joseph doing. We see him caring about someone else's problems and his troubles. And we know that's true. I'm assuming you've experienced that in your own life. We have these things that we think are big, and they very likely are big and something we're carrying. But we focus on someone else's problem, and ours kind of takes the back seat for a while. And trust me, it'll probably still be there when you're ready to pick it up again and go. But it takes that focus off, focusing on other people's problems. And we see Joseph wanted to help them. He was reaching out. He honestly cared for them. And it wasn't something that he could get out of it on his own. He wasn't looking for anything to get out of it, personal gain or anything. He honestly cared about them. And he was trying to cheer them up. And he says, well, let me help you. God can interpret dreams. Please tell them to me. So we go to this next portion here. We won't read this, 9 through 13. The chief cupbearer gives his dream, and Joseph gives the interpretation of it. And then in verse 14, it says, Joseph gave the interpretation was that the cupbearer would be restored to his former job and come back into the graces of the king, of Pharaoh. And so Joseph says in verse 14, only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me in the pit. He's pleading his case. And this also kind of, I think, strengthens that Joseph believes this is going to come true when he says, oh, you're going to be reinstated in 3 days, you're going to be reinstated. And by the way, when you're back in good graces with Pharaoh, can you mention me? I'm here. I got stuck here. I'm innocent. I got put in here for something that I didn't do. It was a false accusation. Please get me out of here. And he mentions that he was brought out of the land of the Hebrew. So I wonder if he was longing for home, if he would have wanted to go back home. Well, we see the baker notices that the cupbearer got a good result, so he says, hey, maybe mine will be good too. And the next following verses here, the baker gives his dream, and we know, we're not going to go into the dreams necessarily specifically. We know the baker's dream and its interpretation was not good, and Joseph said, well, in 3 days you are going to be executed. The king is not happy with you. And then in verses 20 and following there through the end of the chapter, we'll read that. This is how it comes true. It comes to pass, what he had prophesied or what he had interpreted for them. Verse 20 says, on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And then the first phrase in verse 1 of chapter 41 says, after 2 whole years. So here, one question I have is, how could the cupbearer forget? How would that be possible? Something like this happened to you. You had a dream. 3 days later, it came true. Someone interpreted it for you, and it came true in such a monumental way. And the person you were in prison with, his dream came true too, but his was not a good end. How could he just not remember? How could he forget that Joseph had interpreted this dream for him and told him this? Well, and for 2 whole years. He forgot this for 2 whole years. It wasn't a week later, oh yeah, I promised Joseph I'd talk to the Pharaoh. It was 2 whole years. And I think it has something to do with timing, God's timing. The timing wasn't right yet. So for 2 whole years, we see Joseph is still in this prison. He carries on. We assume he continues to carry on as before, continue to work, continue to stay busy, continue to serve where he is. In a New York Times article, journalist Alex Stone tells the story of how executives at a Houston airport faced and then solved a cascade of passenger complaints about long waits at the baggage claim. They first decided to hire more baggage handlers, reducing wait times to an industry-beating average of 8 minutes. But complaints persisted. This made no sense to the executives until they discovered that, on average, passengers took just 1 minute to walk to baggage claim, resulting in a hurry-up-and-wait situation. The walk time was not the problem. The remaining 7 empty minutes of staring at the baggage carousel was. So, in a burst of innovation, the executives moved the arrival gates further away from the baggage claim area. Passengers now had to walk much further, but their bags were often waiting for them when they arrived. Problem solved. The complaints dropped. That was an easy fix, right? This article goes on. It says, for the same article, Stone interviewed an MIT operations researcher, Richard Larson, the world's leading expert on waiting in lines, to discover the psychology behind our waiting. What happened at Houston Airport makes for a perfect illustration. According to Larson, the length of our wait is not as important as what we're doing while we wait. Often, the psychology of queuing is more important than the statistics of the wait itself, says Larson. Essentially, we tolerate occupied time, for example, walking to baggage claim, far better than unoccupied time, such as standing at the baggage carousel. Give us something to do while we wait, and the wait becomes endurable. This is why so often waiting on God feels like unoccupied time to us. We wait. But what is really happening behind the scenes of our life? Is God actually doing anything? Waiting on God implies developing a new perspective of what God is doing while we wait on Him. I think that's, insightful, and I can identify with that a little bit. With the passengers having to stand there looking at an empty baggage carousel. Where's my bags? But if it took longer to walk there, you don't think about it, right? If we're busy, if we're working while waiting, time goes a little bit faster. I hear that at the coffee shop a lot. The employees, they say, man, if there's a line, time just flies. If there isn't a line, if it's a slow day and there's nothing to do, the minutes just drag. It just seems like it takes a long time. If we stay busy, time seems to, or has a way of speeding up in a way, or feels more. It feels like it is speeding up. God's timing here in Joseph's life wasn't right for him. What would have happened if, let's say he would have gotten out? What if he would have gotten out 2 years before God was ready for him, before God needed him to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams? Where would he have been? We don't know because God's plan worked out. But it is something to think about. If Joseph would have moved out from under God's will and escaped, for example, he would have had to get out of town. And he wouldn't have been in the place where God needed him when he needed him. We see following here Pharaoh's dream. We're not going to go into that or the interpretation of it necessarily. I think we all know the story. But the fact is, Pharaoh had a dream, and he asked all his wise men, the people around him, he said, hey, I had a dream. Tell me what it means. Nobody could interpret it. Verse 8, I think it says, but there was none that could interpret them to Pharaoh. And in verse 9, finally, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. And he says, you know what? When I was in prison, there was a guy in there who interpreted our dreams for us, and they came true. It was legit. You should get him out. Bring him up here. He could tell you what your dreams mean. And again, you're thinking, this was 2 years later. Here is Joseph, still faithful, still working in this prison, and still where God needed him to be for the right time and the right place. And Pharaoh heeds the advice of the cupbearer. He brings him up out of prison, and Joseph comes in front of Pharaoh here. And the first thing that we see, verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Here was Joseph's chance to say, yeah, well, maybe we could negotiate a little bit. You know, my living arrangements aren't the best. Maybe we could negotiate a little bit. No, what Joseph says, verse 16, Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. And I picture Pharaoh maybe stopping and saying, what? What do you mean? But he goes on and says, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Joseph, a man of integrity, chooses to give God the glory, chooses to hand over the glory to God, saying, and just be willing to be his mouthpiece for him. And we see Pharaoh relates his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph interprets them. And then in verse 33, he gives wise counsel. On top of interpreting the dream, he gives this wise counsel of how Pharaoh could react and deal with the coming 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, and how to do this. And one of the things he said was set up a wise man to be in charge of all this, to get all this together. And verse 37, we'll start in there, verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Notice all his servants as well. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And we'll just continue there. And Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your counsel no one shall lift up a hand or a foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he entered into the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. We see Pharaoh is pleased with Joseph's reply. And he says, Well, I don't know of any better option for a wise person than you. And it's because Joseph was exemplifying, he was being a man of integrity, a person of integrity that Pharaoh knew he could trust. The wisdom that he was showing through him was from God. So we look, all these things that Pharaoh gave to him or put on him. Joseph's life was a roller coaster. He went from the age of 17. In chapter 39, it mentions that he was 17. He was still at his father's in his father's house. People assume that was the age he was when he came into slavery. But he went from 17, from being the favorite son, to being a slave. The rug got pulled out from under him, being the favorite son to being a slave. Then he got elevated to being the favorite slave for Potiphar, to being cast into prison for a crime he didn't commit. And in prison, he again worked his way up to being the favorite prisoner. He had charge over the other prisoners. And from a prisoner, he was brought from prison and made second in command of the entire land of Egypt. Only God can do that. If we would see that today, I'm not going to get into politics. I know there's people with opinions that some of our politicians should be in prison, but if literally someone would be brought from prison and made the vice president of our country, we would think, man, that's way out there. Here, that's what happened here. And it was God working in his time through people, through Joseph specifically here. We see that God brought him through all these things, and in all these things he was faithful. There was, if my math is right, he was 30. It says he was 30 when he was in the service of Pharaoh here. So 13 years of this roller coaster ride in Egypt, in a foreign land, and he continued to work, continued to be faithful where he was called. Through all of it, he was working hard and being faithful. So what can we apply? What can we take from this, apply to ourselves or challenge ourselves with? There's just a few thoughts that I had. Joseph had to be a prisoner before he could be a ruler. I don't think that's necessarily true of all of us. I don't know that, but in Joseph's specific instance, that's where he was needed. He needed to be a prisoner in place. God put him in that place before he could raise him up to be a ruler. Maybe God has you in a waiting period right now. Be faithful where God has placed you. There's times in our life when it feels like, boy, it's just God's not moving. What's going on here? Maybe you feel like God's not using me. We're called to be faithful where we are, to be working while waiting. Jesus said, "He who is faithful in little is faithful also in much." And we see that that's the example that Joseph gave to us. I guess for myself, the challenge that I had was to keep working while waiting. To keep working while waiting. See what God has for us. With those thoughts, let's stand for prayer or dismissal. Lord, we just thank you for your word. We thank you for these stories, these accounts that we can go back and read from your word and receive a challenge, receive a blessing and an encouragement. Lord, I just pray that as we go from here, each one of us, that we can continue to be faithful, continue to work while we're waiting on you, and wherever we are, whatever we're doing, Lord, we can keep that in mind, that we focus on you. And through that we can reach out to those around us. We can be aware of other people's needs and help them as needed. Lord, I just pray a blessing on each one that's here this morning, and as we depart from here, just pray we can have a good week, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.